Hans, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast for part 5 of our series on music, mind control, and psychobiology. And today we're going to be getting into some of the really dark stuff as noted by the introductory music to this episode, AC/DC, Hell's Bells. And anyway, I'm looking forward to this part. I think we're going to really lay out a lot in this episode.
Yeah, myself as well. And, and I hope that, it's, when I actually, uncovering some of those different things about Altamont, for example, which I had known about, but I started, uncovering these different layers. That's one of those things where you start to see that some of these people are actually really, really evil human beings. And they are, at the same time, they're also kind of pitiful in a certain way, but also they have immense power and they know it and they use it, and that should be kept in mind. So we heard a little bit there of AC/DC, and AC/DC just as a hard rock band, pretty solid, basically blues based, Chuck Berry. On a little bit of speed and a little more distortion, but AC/DC actually means you have this positive negative polarity, right? And that's a very important part of this process. If you look at sort of even from the Kabbalistic, or you look at some of these occult processes, you taking these two, male and female, these two opposites, and getting this energy. But AC/DC, maybe just talking about a power circuit. But that's an example. Let's just get there as a band.
Let me just ask, what do you think, anything too? When I was a kid, I remember AC/DC being associated to After Christ, Death Comes.
AC/DC, it's the original meaning kind of in that era is AC/DC actually meant someone that goes both ways, like bisexual.
Okay.
Or transvestite, so you're AC/DC, But I don't know about that. It could be, but also it does. But it does have this idea. If you look at the lightning bolt and the two forms, right? This is exactly fundamentally Crowleyan magic in terms of the process. Not stating that's the case with AC/DC, but just highlighting that. And Angus Young, when he performed on a quote from Angus Young, I think it's like Hit Parader magazine. Quote, "Someone else is steering me. I become possessed when on stage."
Now, that's exactly what Beyonce and a lot of these other artists state.
And I remember right before I performed, I raised my hands up, and it was kind of the first time I felt something else come into me, and I knew that was going to be my coming out.
And I'm going to have to look because they appear to be monarch victims, and the monarch victims all show a monarch butterfly somewhere in their stuff. So if we found Angus with one, that would be interesting. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, no, and that's, to be honest, this is why this project, it's kind of like I have just that example of being possession, quotes, video examples. I could just show video clips for 3 hours and show that. But I'll start off with AC/DC because overall, okay, it's not like, death metal per se. They do have some roots rock elements, so they're not really a bad band, and their music is certainly not as heavy and not as dark. They just, they wear their blue jeans, working class guys. The guy just, finished working on your car and now he's out there singing, and you just feel like they're kind of, blue collar guys letting off steam. If you look at their lyrics, you notice something that they include a lot of very direct satanic references, and you notice Angus Young is actually, he's shaking his head up and down that entire performance. Try doing that for 5 minutes. That's going to put you into a major, major altered state of consciousness. So Angus Young, if you do that, time to the music, like that, that's going to, that's, whatever. So he's definitely in some kind of trance. But, Hell's Bells, Highway to Hell, I'm on the highway to hell, these songs, and you maybe play a couple clips of them, are very direct invitations to this lifestyle, and they're offering this. And in a sense, they're initiating the audience into this model, so to speak, that, rock, that being the devil's music, also being attractive, this being associated with freedom, but also taking just a hard rock band where people don't necessarily think of them as being satanic. They just think, they're just a good time. They're not like putting on Slayer or some of these really, really dark music. But that case in point, as a tipping off point, there's, I'm just going to read a bunch of quotes here from various artists just to get a sense of how prevalent this is without, going too far into it. So this is Led Zeppelin. And Led Zeppelin, of course, very interesting band in that Led Zeppelin represents a much further evolution of the implementation of these elements, right? So you have a very soft cell, subliminal, underground implementation, say in the Beatles, and you have a very slightly more dramatic in the Rolling Stones, but, Jimmy Page, he purchased Aleister Crowley's house in Loch Ness, Bullyskin, and that's where, Crowley had this, major ceremony where he tried to summon the devil, so to speak, and it's supposed to be haunted, and Jimmy Page moved there, and he's known as the, persona non grata. He owns massive amounts of Crowley memorabilia. He buys, so basically he's always out there buying original texts. So Crowley has majorly influenced Jimmy Page. But here's a quote from Jimmy Page. He's like, "I was living it. That's all there is to it. It was my life. That fusion of magic and music, aside magic spelled with a K. Yes, I knew what I was doing. There's no point in saying about it, because the more you discuss it, the more eccentric you appear to be. But the fact is, as far as I was concerned, it was working, so I used it. I'll leave the subject by saying that the 4 musical elements of Led Zeppelin, making a 5th, is magic unto itself. That's the alchemical process. Okay? Magic with a K. So he is, stating that they are using, and we'll get into this Hermetic stuff maybe a bit further on, but he's using and looking at the band as transforming themselves and the audience using ritual magic, and again, using Crowley's spelling of the term. And that's it. So let's look at Ozzy Osbourne. And Ozzy Osbourne actually thought he was possessed by Satan. And that's another example of someone you don't really want to grow up to be. Maybe you do. I mean, I'm sure he had a lot of fun in the early 1970s, but he's certainly paying the price. But for a while, Ozzy actually thought he was possessed by Satan. And this is a quote from 1984. Quote, "I really wish I knew why I've done some of the things I've done over the years. Sometimes I think I'm possessed by some outside spirit. A few years ago, I was convinced of that. I thought I was truly possessed by the devil. I remember sitting through The Exorcist a dozen times, saying to myself, yeah, I can relate to that." Okay, so that's Ozzy. And Exorcist, that's another example of a film, right? That's and one thing to say that there are documentaries done even on Crowley and stuff, that some of these documentaries, that if they use these real quick cut visuals, lots of flashing lights, they actually can also be inducing you into this particular something or other, so that's there. Neil Young, rock and roll is everybody's effing music. I would certainly hope that it's a devil's music. But it's not just the devil's music. I think that's where God and the devil shake hands, right there. And, when we get into the process church, we'll trace the process church back to some very interesting sources that are not well known, but that's sort of a process church mentality. But notice Neil Young said, I certainly hope it's the devil's music. And again, keep in mind, I'm not claiming anything per se, but I would just like people, I'd say hold both positions, that this is just entertainment, that they're being rebellious, the devil, I'm having a devil of a good time. What the hell? Let's just let it all hang out. Or the other side of that is that there is a lot of belief and emphasis, and there's a good chance that a lot of these artists are not exactly in control of what they do, or they are working or are simply vectors for some other types of forces, but sometimes they're consciously.
Going back to my comment a few minutes ago about Project Monarch.
Exactly, yeah, and that's a whole other way to go into it. That's actually what I've seen. I'm starting to see is the scientific part merging with the occult, and even seeing crossover of certain people.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, well, in terms of very much doing the same processes that trying to do through ritual magic, doing that through, electromagnetic type of signal entrainment and stuff like that. But anyways, just quote from the Beatles, 1966, John Lennon, London Evening Standard. Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me. John Lennon, I'll talk a little bit about how he was introduced to Crowley and stuff. And I'm still trying to figure out whether or not the degree of malevolence that is Mick Jagger. I mean, I think I'm starting to see now Mick Jagger is a very, very, very dark individual. I'm not going to give facts about that per se that I have in terms of the really heavy stuff I'll get into, but it's possible John Lennon, he got into, he was offered drugs, started dosing, and then he got some people moved in and pushed him in a certain direction, and he certainly embraced it by choice. There's no question about that. But it is a possibility that he thought it was something else. Again, have a good time, let your hair down. It's possible he was caught up in that. It's possible he was also a major agential force. Anyways, but Crowley, again, and John Lennon were certainly connected, and we'll get into that more later. Here's a quote from Eddie Mason, who was a major person with the Society for Music Arrangers, also possibly a little bit connected with the Acoustical Society of America. Quote, "We manipulate people like crazy. Every film composer mixes his experience with the talent for musical manipulation, then projects that Machiavellian power gut to gut." So, and there's been a lot of studies, and this one I want to emphasize is that music itself, a song by itself may not have a particular effect, but in a contextual basis, and especially with repetition, especially when you add audio, visual, transcultural reference points, especially when you add in ritual performative aspects and symbolic language, you get a very, very powerful tool and so a lot of research on music describes it as an encoder. That is, music can affect the way we encode or frame our experiences. And in a sense, that's what a ritual is too. It gives you sort of a transformation. And if a ritual is successful, you're going to come out of it feeling like a different person. So this quote I just gave you describes that aspect as, being aware of that, is say, hey, we can change how people see the world. But more interestingly, it can act, as I've talked about in earlier episodes, as a way that changes how you perceive the world, how you encode your experience. So it's a way, it's psychological terms, again, a very powerful encoder. Okay, give you one example. If there's someone who has a very traumatic experience, and that will affect the rest of their life after that, right? There's somebody, my whole life changed after I started going to church, or I saw myself as a football player, but these are examples on maybe a smaller way of your, a process that's encoding, changing how you're really putting together all the different inputs in your life. I'll get more into that later. It's a little complex. Ray Manzarek. During the 1960s, we were like in a Zen state of ecstasy. The whole country was on peace, you know, make love, not war. That's what it was all about. After having my LSD experiences and then reading about it through history, I realized that psychedelics, Christian mystics, and Jewish mystics, and Kabbalah, and certainly Islam. And that's an incomplete sentence. Sorry about that. It's okay. Every once in a while, in from the microphone, I would hear some strange guttural Indian chanting. And strange enough, it came out of Jim Morrison's mouth, you know, and I could see Jim's eyes roll back in his head. And I loved it because the American Indian had come out to offer the white people of America harmony with Mother Earth. And Ray Manzarek, again, because the shamanistic aspect, this is where it really becomes apparent. So Ray Manzarek, quote, I didn't realize what this whole shamanistic thing was until the ingestion of psychedelics, trying to figure out what is the purpose of existence. God, I'm bummed out, I said. Then I invested psychedelics. There's certain guys on this planet, Morrison, Perry Farrell, Pearl Jam singer. When they sing on stage, I love it. Not being that all the way, being the Apollonian. You know, you have to bring in the Dionysian. Jim Morrison was an electric shaman with his electric shaman band behind him. And then he goes on. Sorry, that some of that quote was cut off the page. But
well, sure. And, you know, and that's part of the whole neo-feudalism, archaic revival agenda that, you know, that Joe Atwell and I have spent so much time exposing.
Yeah. But here's the thing, you know, I mean, I don't know if you guys have been around trance possession ceremonies, and I have. Okay. I have seen people possessed or seeming like they're possessed. And I'm telling you, it's pretty intense. I mean, I was in India, you know, my first book, Trance, Ritual, and Rhythm. And I was with these villagers, you know, and they, you know, using these drum beats, and it would usually be one person. But the first thing they would do to prove they're in trance, they'd either like put their hand into some molten metal or, you know, something like that. They'd slice themselves with a sword and not get cut. And it was pretty intense, things that I've seen. I've also seen people possessed by, I saw a guy supposedly possessed by a spirit of a Native American guy that was basically trying to attack me, speaking some weird language. I've seen people, you know, I've seen this happen. You know, Gilles Rouget on Music and Trance believes it's primarily auto-suggestive, but someone goes into a trance and there's a possession thing, they do become very different people. And if you've seen that...
Well, and again, though, that is trance, that is hypnosis, and when you're in that state, you have, you know, a handler guiding you.
You want to hold that in that hand. You really can't feel that, can you?
Seriously.
Absolutely dead. It's just like a piece of dead meat on the table. It's like sticking a needle through a piece of dead meat. Go on, just push it through. Push it right through and out the other side. Right through.
Yeah. Well, you know, and like I said, I've seen stuff that is, even I'll give you an example. I was playing last night, and not possession, but there's a guy, I won't mention his name, very good blues guitarist, but he was sitting in, and this guy's real old school, you know, he's lived a real blues lifestyle, been in jail, whatever, super talented musician, but he was playing. I let him go up there and play, and then he looked at me, and he switched the level to that dark stuff, dark blues, deep blues, mojo stuff, and I could feel the energy change, and the musical energy change. And it actually, I went outside. I'm like, I don't want to listen to this but he looked at me right in the eyes, and so this guy's from, you know, deep South. This guy knows this stuff, and so as an example, this is not necessarily being possessed, but you know. You can draw something from inside of yourself and project that through music. You can also, you know, there is something to be said for the morphogenic field that is sort of a collective field of consciousness or electromagnetic, you know, energy, which again is talked about in even some military documents. So if you ever been in a crowd, you ever been at a football game, I mean, there is a group consciousness, right?
Absolutely. One of the easiest ways to mind control people is when they're in a large group.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
which feeds right into the whole concert, you know, just, you know, concert stadium thing, just like football games. You get all those people in one location. That's the best way to control them. Did you have more quotes you want to go into there?
Yeah, just a few more. Yeah, and just real briefly, I mean, I can show so many clips of singers, their eyes rolling back up in their heads. Okay, even someone as innocuous as Tori Amos. I don't know if I have her. Oh, I have a song of hers.
Well, but we have to differentiate if if they're a monarch victim, which a lot of these people appear to be. Like I mentioned, Beyonce earlier, and Tori Amos, I think, was one of them as well. But if they are going into that trance, if they have a handler off stage, like who was it? Beyonce has. What's his name? Now I forget his name, but if he's off stage or their handler is off stage, they could actually put them into the trance. But it appears that some of these musicians, as soon as they hear the music begin, they actually begin to enter into that trance stage. So again, if they're a monarch victim, that would play into that because they would be entering into that trance, and then they can become that second person that does the performance on stage while the handler is still directing them.
Yeah, and even in bands, sometimes, I mean, if you look at the Doors, Ray Manzarek is just there noodling away, kind of like Schroeder, while Jim Morrison is, and so Ray Manzarek, does have a pretty articulate understanding of this. And going back to last episode, he talks about the Kundalini, right? You making the Kundalini rise, which is, you can, and this is also known as, there's a study in Stanford, it did about music introducing quote unquote states of ecstasy, altered states. They typed as thrills, right? But thrill is kind of like you get this lift, you get this rush, and even sometimes, a kind of a brief altered state. And so anyways, David Crosby, quote, just through music, I can alter my audience's value systems. Okay, there we go. Like Black Sabbath, again, back then a little bit, they described having a fifth member. They described channeling their songs.
We've always, within the band, said there is a fifth member, a mystical member, yeah. We've always said there's something looking over us.
I don't know what it is, the invisible, I don't know what, binding that keeps us together.
And the only way that I can describe that, probably in its best, the best way for me is that when we were playing our first songs together, and especially our first the first 3 albums, for instance, we would literally show up in a room, and it was almost as if the songs were already written.
And this is something you find a lot of times, people saying they're channeling their songs, and this is coming from outside. Who knows? But especially if you look at the idea, and if you look at occult organizations, a lot of times these secret societies, they would have a visible person that's in charge, but they're possibly someone behind them. So this one person, it's a type of network. You look at like actor network theory. One person is, you have this leader figure who's manipulated behind the scenes, who's manipulating these next level people or controlling them, and it just trickles down.
Right. It sounds like your typical intelligence cells, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But the point is that it's quite possible that some of these rock stars, in there, just like someone, Blavatsky is like the kingpin of the organization and seems like reveling in power and glory, but maybe behind the scenes there's someone also pulling her strings.
Sure.
And this is an example of a song that Tori Amos said she channeled. Father Lucifer. It's called Father Lucifer. Father Lucifer, you never look so sane. You always did prefer the drizzle to the rain. Tell me you're still in love with the milkmaid. How the Lizzies? How's your Jesus Christ been hanging? Nothing's going to stop me from floating. Nothing's going to stop me from floating. He says he reckons I'm a watercolor stain. He says I run and then I run from him and then I run. He didn't see me watching from the aeroplane. He wiped a tear and then threw away our apple seed. That's encoded language, right? You can pull that back. There's a lot there. Nothing's going to stop me from floating. Nothing's going to stop me from floating. Every day's my wedding day, though the baby's still in his comatose state. I'll dye my own Easter eggs, spelled D-I-E. Don't go yet. Just don't go. And Beanie lost the sunset, but that's okay. Does Joe bring flowers to Marilyn's grave? And girls that eat pizza never gain weight, never gain weight, never gain weight. Father Lucifer, you never look so sane. You always did prefer the drizzle to the rain. Tell me that you're still in love with that milkmaid. How's the Lizzies? How's your Jesus Christ been hanging? So that is an example of partially what's known as twilight language, There's a Masonic figure known as Dr. Syntax, who creates this obscure shadow language that has multiple tiers of meaning and multiple layers of meaning. There's also trigger words that can be associated with fans. For example, the female fans that may be associated with Tori Amos, because I'm certainly not a fan of hers. But she very bluntly and directly talks about Lucifer coming to her and writing the song through her, and she does also go into some kind of weird trance states in her songs. And this is not a quote, but Marilyn Manson, who's another far out dude, he talked about this band Lilith Fair, which was all these female singers. Familiar with Lilith Fair? Lilith Fair was a tour of all these sort of female singers, mostly acoustic stuff. They were doing a lot of different stars. It was really popular, and this was certainly a very, very influential film. Tour, and it has actually influenced sort of the kind of contemporary kind of roots music. So you have Sarah McLachlan, started in 1996. But Lilith Fair, what Marilyn Manson, he said that you think what I'm doing is subversive. Lilith Fair, that's the real heavy stuff. He said, because people don't even know, and they just swallow it down like it's cake or whatever. And Lilith is actually this, demon. Lilith, the demon, it's actually a particular goddess. There's a lot of connections, but he described that group again as being much more dark and dangerous than what he's doing. And I don't think he was being sarcastic. So that's we won't get into them, but there's a lot of these things where you have a certain group, and notice in that song lyrics I read, there's an encoded thing about eating disorder, right? Don't eat the pizza. Never gain weight. Never gain weight. Don't eat the pizza. Does Joe bring flowers to Marilyn's grave? Beanie lost the sunset, but that's okay. Someone else can take the time to analyze that, because I'm not going to do it. But so that's just a real superficial glance of just many, many, many hundreds of quotes here that relate to that.
All right, you want to dive into the Do What Thou Wilt article discussion?
Sure, yeah. So this Do What Thou Wilt, this is something I'm kind of working on here, kind of almost done here, but I just was looking again at the terms do what thou wilt, do your own thing, do what you want to do. This is the mantra of rock and roll. This is the raison d'etre of rock and roll. Do your own thing. Be free, express yourself, free your mind and your ass will follow, et cetera, et cetera. You can find this. There's all kinds of songs called Do What Thou Wilt. So, and again, after seeing the G.G. Allen guy and seeing that as this just completely, what does this lead to? And I know so many people that are caught up into this. I know so many people that it's almost like religious doctrine, and in fact, it is religious doctrine. I got a bunch of other quotes I won't go into, but Paul Stanley of Kiss describes it as like, rock and roll is a church and I'm the preacher, and the fans are my congregation. There's a lot of idea that this message of Do What Thou Wilt is sort of the gospel of rock, and the whole rebellion against having 2.5 kids in a car, which everyone cites as, we're free. We made our way out of that trap of responsibility, and we're going to break through. And this keeps happening again and again and again. And you see, if you want to look at, if you don't get out of it where it takes you, you look at someone like Sid Vicious. You look at all these other, Graham Bond, who just became completely, he got very much involved in Crowley, and he had, very much involved in black magic and ended up just nuts. There's just so many examples.
What's his name from Pink Floyd? And then there's, the original Bon Scott, speaking of AC/DC.
Yeah, and Syd Barrett is a very interesting figure, because Syd Barrett was actually the really talented one in this group, right? He was the one writing all these songs, but by the end of his life, he was connected with some of the same people that we find in this art scene that connects with the Beatles, with Crowleyanism, with the Fool Art Collective, with some of these other things that were going on around there. He had an LSD dealer living with him. He was constantly dosed. He was dosed. If you went over there, people would bring their own water because it was a nonstop party, his flat. And he would be dosed all the time. He would be dosed, and he was really, started to lose his mind. And there's an album cover, if you could bring it up, of, release of Syd Barrett's hits that shows this complete mind control thing with like this mirror in the park or whatever. So Syd Barrett was certainly a victim, but I mean, we're really talking about thousands and thousands of victims, and not even the people that end up dead or the people that end up, never really, sort of in a, as a ETARD or just kind of a burnout. But how about those people in arrested adolescence their whole life? They'd never get out of this era. How many people I know that love 1950s doo-wop and they're older guys and they still bring their classic cars and go listen to these concerts, and they're still their identity, which can be fine, but there's a lot of people that are really trapped in specific identities that they're not even aware of, that this is a manipulated state, that they're into. And so, so again, this freedom idea, I ended up pulling apart a lot of different pieces of the puzzle, which I found to be pretty surprising.
Let's dig into some of those. Let's go into Hassani Sabbah, and let's dig in. Okay,
so this particular doctrine, one of the first times it's sort of explicitly stated is in the personage of Hassani Sabbah, who was very, very interesting figure in world history, extremely influential, but also became kind of a part of the counterculture in a sort of an odd way. And you can even find some bands named after him. He's certainly connected with more of the thinking man's, thinking man's countercultural person. But just to be very brief about Hassani Sabbah, he was a sort of a revolutionary, counter-revolutionary in the, in Islam, in the, first century AD, around, 1220s, et cetera, like that. And Hassani Sabbah converted to Ismailism, which was sort of a, not heretical totally, but it was a form of Shia Islam that described sort of a incarnation of imams, right? These particular imams would incarnate at different times. I won't get into the whole history of Islam. But when we look at Hassani Sabbah, he was known as the old man of the mountain. So he was, it's called Alamat is the name of his citadel. And from this citadel, he was directing this network of deep cover assassins who were basically they were suicide, so to speak, assassins. But
that's where we get the famous. That's where the term assassin comes from, which is from hashish.
Hashishan, yeah. And so what Hassani Sabbah did was well, let me say, first of all, Hassani Sabbah was an alchemist. He was a mathematician. He was a major intellect as well. He had the Quran memorized. So he was an extremely, extremely powerful and highly intelligent person that was familiar with the cutting edge of all the arts and sciences, going back even to Hermetic stuff or whatever. I mean, he was, So the word assassin comes from hashishan, which is because this has a tiered level of induction like you see in, different degrees in the Masons. So we have the same thing of getting introduced on different levels sort of the pyramid. And Hassani Sabbah was on top of the pyramid, right, in his mountain. But what would happen was people, if they were chosen for this particular stage of initiation, they would be drugged and they would wake up in this like palace surrounded by beautiful women who were taking care of them, so to speak. These were unmarried guys. You won't imagine what it was like, trying to go out and hang out in, the first century AD. As a Muslim, it's not, there was a lot of, they were taken to paradise. They were given wine, drugs, opium, and, had, completely women playing musical instruments and dancing. At that time in mainline Islam, music was also forbidden or highly, highly strictly regulated, as was wine was haram, forbidden. And these things actually, if you did that in your own home, you could be killed very easily, especially in the Ottoman Empire. So they would wake up and then they would be drugged again after this experience, taken down from the mountain citadel and said, "You've been to paradise. Will you accept this training?" And they would go into training and they would take positions in all kinds of different agencies. They could be a servant, they could be a government official, they could sometimes be in deep cover for a decade. But when the word came, they would assassinate. And most of the times, these assassinations were done as public spectacles. They were done with their, imagine the psychological effect if, this prince is there and his trusted advisor, who's been following meekly behind him for a decade, suddenly comes out and stabs a guy in the heart and just stands there and doesn't do anything. Major shock, right? You have sort of this, not only the political agenda, but the shock value of that act was very, very powerful. And so he was able to do it as a force multiplier for what he was doing.
Do you want to make the connection there to modern times, if the audience hasn't made the connection already?
Well, yeah. So very interesting enough. Okay, number one, Hassani Sabbah was cited by William S. Burroughs, and this idea of creating mind-controlled assassins. So he became on sort of the intellectual tip of the counterculture, again, like Burroughs.
Yeah, and by the way, just to interject really quickly there, Hans, there's a new movie coming out called American Ultra, where they are these people who are sleeper assassins and stuff like this.
Yeah.
American Ultra, if that isn't in your face enough.
Well, Hassani Sabbah, why he came into my article was simply because of his statement. The chains of the law have been broken. Okay? Nothing is real. Everything is permitted. And you break your fast with wine. That was the highest initiatory stage in his version of Ismaili Islam, right? But you see that this Ismaili sect, Aga Khan, they were sort of persecuted, went underground. The Aga Khan is still there. I've actually, been to his centers. But Hassani Sabbah, especially you have to imagine at the time for that, especially within Islam, is incredibly radical. And the whole idea was that Qiyamah, the resurrection, the day of judgment has already happened. Time has ended. History has ended. There's now no more laws. And you'll bring about, okay, go ahead, eat, drink, and have merry. But very interestingly enough, we have the Altamont Festival, where you have the Hells Angels coming in and murdering somebody, as well as 2 other deaths. Altamont. They changed the venue 20 hours before the performance. Very odd. What's even more odd is that Mick Jagger was in a movie that was released in 1970 called Performance, and he's playing the part of a rock star. And in that movie, he recites the text of Hassani Sabbah, as through William S. Burroughs, but Hassani Sabbah's proclamation, as well as his encoding for becoming the assassin.
The old man was called in the language of Persia Hassani Sabbah, and his people were called the Hashishin. He had caused a valley between 2 mountains to be enclosed and turned into a garden, so large and beautiful his people believed it was paradise. And there was a fortress at the entrance, strong enough to resist all the world. Now the old man would cause those of his young men, whom he had chosen to be his Hashishin, his assassins, to be given a potion which cast them into a deep sleep, and to be carried into the garden, so that when they awoke, they believed they were in paradise. And there were damsels and young girls there, who dallied with them to their heart's content, so that they had what young men desire. Thus it was that when the old man decided to send one of his assassins upon a mission, such as to have a prince slain, he would send for one of these youths and say, "Go thou and kill, and when thou returnest, my angel shall bear thee into paradise. And shouldst thou die, nevertheless, I will send my angel to carry thee back into paradise."
But this whole idea is an interesting Burroughs clip, talking about Hassani Sabbah.
Last words of Hassani Sabbah, the old man of the mountain. Listen to my last words anywhere. Listen, all you boards, governments, syndicates, nations of the world, and you powers behind what filth deals consummate.
And the way I got interested in Hassani Sabbah actually was because of Burroughs, and he frames him as this countercultural icon, smash the systems, bring about, revolution. But the fact is Hassani Sabbah was creating mind-controlled assassins, also connected with the Templars, and had a major, major impact on intelligence services, including the occult aspects, so to speak. But very, very important figure. And you want me to should I take this out?
I was just going to add really quickly, and then you can continue. And William S. Burroughs was heavily involved in the intelligence community. He was involved with the Greenwich Village MK Ultra team with Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and Joyce Glassman, etc.
Yeah. And so, that's just one example. But that's where we find the do what thou wilt doctrine, right? The chains of law have been broken.
Right.
And so from that period, we move forward. There's a Abyssinian sect. There's some other sects and sort of more minor secret societies that we'll talk about, or groups. But Zabbatai Zevi is a very, very important figure in expressing this doctrine, dogma, and in taking it to another level, in that initially this was done sort of in a public way. But Zabbatai Zevi was a Jewish individual who was proclaimed to be the Messiah by a particular scholar in Jerusalem. I think it was Nathan of Gaza in 1666. So he was proclaimed to be the Messiah. Okay. Again, these are 1666 and not the Christ. But Zabbatai Zevi also became a very powerful political figure. But his doctrine was that in order to, you could say, bring about the new heaven and new earth, the transmutation of space-time, to bring the so to speak, you have as it is above, so it shall be below, the bridging heaven and earth and creating the new age, whatever. That was done by breaking every law, every taboo known. And the more evil, the more sin, the more orgies, the more incest, the more thievery, murder, whatever you did, the closer you brought the tikkun alam, the healing of the world, about. So that was his very interesting doctrine, which is kind of wild in that it kind of reminds me of something that some rock star might say is, just basically we're doing good because we do anything we want. And that's exactly what G.G. Allen said. He said, I do anything, whatever I want. I do whatever I want. I'm totally free and you're in chains. And so that's, that's that aspect there. And that's a big subject. I won't, go too much into that topic because but needless to say, his reincarnation, Jakob Frank, this guy said he was the reincarnation of the Sabbateans. The Sabbateans practiced this type of being hidden in plain sight, meaning that they took on totally different identities. So Zabbatai Zevi, in converting to Islam, he was he was a manic depressive. He was a pretty, he ended up having tens of thousands of followers at one point, but they all converted to Islam, and then they obscured or hid their beliefs. They hid their real practices and did this in secret, as did the Batin of this particular Ismaili Islam of Hassani Sabbah. We move a little bit forward. We have the Hellfire Club, and we have Rabelais. Rabelais is a medieval author, wrote 1400s, and he wrote a book about these two giants. It was considered to be a satire, but it described Gargantua, and I forget the other giant's name, but they lived in this monastery called the Abbey of Thelema, and inscribed over that was, do what thou wilt. Do what you want to do. And supposedly a satire, these two giants, their basic code of the monastery that they lived in was to indulge everything they could, basically do whatever they wanted, wake up when they wanted. And this is written by a monk, right? So Rabelais was a monk. He was an author. He did run into some trouble for some of his satires, but he had some patrons that protected him. But basically, do what thou wilt. And then we look at Crowley, Ablia Thelema, do what thou wilt, taking it out of this book by Rabelais, right? Middle-aged book. And he even names his religious cult Thelemites, based off of literary satire. Interesting, huh? And the Hellfire Club also based their doctrine off of the Abbey of Thelema. Sir Francis Dashwood, this was sort of a club for the elites of English society, including Mr. Ben Franklin. And they had their, they've been described as anything from basically a Bohemian Grove, type of thing for very rich guys to blow off steam and, do some kind of kinky sex practices with their resident Scarlet Woman, their resident, so to speak, whore or public woman. But basically the Hellfire Club also, again, they based on Rabelais, they're supposed to have this cave where they had these like sort of Dionysian Eleusinian mystery cave underneath the mansion where they had these Hellfire Club meetings. And supposedly, according to some sources, they just poured wine on women's bodies and licked it off and just had a good time. According to other sources, they practiced ritual human sacrifice. And we mentioned on the radio, but underneath Ben Franklin's house, there's a bunch of skeletons. So the Hellfire Club was kind of a rapes club, right? And it's, but again, we a little bit see this thread going through. And then I can just bring it up into Aleister Crowley.
Sure.
And Jan, again, yeah, I'll just go ahead and go through this, and feel free to interject whenever. But Aleister Crowley, as I mentioned in the last episode, has been cited by so many rock stars as a major influence, including Timothy Leary. And so, kind of in tracing Do What Thou Wilt, we really have to come to face with Crowley and Crowleyanity, so to speak. So Aleister Crowley, I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar with his life, but just very briefly, his father was a priest, a lay preacher in the Plymouth Brethren, which is a pretty, you could say, hardcore sect of Christianity. And then after his father died, Crowley began just basically embracing every kind of depravity from a pretty young age. I mean, supposedly he crucified squirrels. When he was in Cambridge, he would have, or at Trinity College, he'd have like 2 to 3 prostitutes delivered per day to his house. He was, wrote extremely graphic, pornographic poetry talking about, I hate to say it, corpophilia, Europhilia, bestiality, whatever. This was his art poetry. But he became a seminal figure in 20th century occult life. He became deeply interested in magic. He became members of the Masons, went all the way through to the 33rd degree, became a very important member of the Golden Dawn. I just want to interject really quickly. He was also a very adept mountain climber, and you want to tell the rest of that story? Yeah. And so he was, actually, say Crowley was sort of, in a certain way, was sort of a Renaissance man in that he was super athletic, very highly intelligent, but he was one of the world's top mountain climbers. And in India, they were climbing a peak, and he got his fellow climbers just were fed up with he was a total megalomaniac. He was, completely always trying to control, and stuff like that. And he walked away, and there was an avalanche, and he stood there and watched his fellow climbers die. Do
you think that he may have caused the avalanche, possibly?
You know what? I mean, it is possible, right, to cause an avalanche if you like kick a rock over or something like that. If you're on top of the hill, I mean, I've done some mountain climbing up in the Himalayas, and there's certainly parts where basically what happens with an avalanche, if you get rock start rolling, the whole mountain starts to rumble, and then it just sends stuff through. So I don't, that's be complete speculation, but needless to say, I mean, no one survived except him, so we don't really know, but he didn't help and just walked away and left them there. And that just kind of shows his personality. And the do what thou wilt, that's the do what thou wilt ethos, right? I feel like I don't care. These guys got mad at me because I'm a bossy, egomaniac, and they're dying in front of me. I'm just going to leave them there.
Yeah.
And so anyways, so Crowley, being such an important influence, I've gotten a lot of other important things about Crowley. Again, embraced by many, many, many rock icons across the board, including being on Sgt. Pepper's cover, which we'll probably go through a little bit later. But so Crowley, very, very influential and really seen as the icon of rock and roll excess. And so just look at another thing about Crowley. Of course, he was an intelligence operative. And so right there, we have this mixture of occult and deep cover intelligence once again. And we also have the fact that Crowley would induce people into his organization. And many of them ended up insane, ended up just living human wrecks. But he was extremely magnetic, charismatic.
Some of them ended up dead as well, I think.
Yeah, some of them ended up dead. He had a wife that died of, he was, miserable treatment. Some committed suicide. Some ended up dying on the street. Some, some just died from their practices. But the one thing, as I mentioned before, is that why is this guy treated with kid gloves? Like, why everyone, you can get the real blunt version of him, or you can get the more just straight version. But why is this guy so much especially in rock and music, treated like such a great person? But just a real rundown of some of his intelligence operations. He was a deep cover agent in America during World War I, wrote anti-British propaganda. He arrived in America on the Lusitania on Halloween Day. Okay, he arrived in America on the Lusitania on Halloween Day. That's kind of interesting. If you look what happened.
And obviously writing controlled opposition for the British government because he was MI6. So, and then he's writing anti-British literature.
Yeah, and he very incendiary literature.
Right.
And in fact, that's how we have a direct smoking gun, is that there's a Defense Intelligence Agency document where someone is basically trying to arrest Crowley, and they're getting the word, no, he's just leave him alone. He's MI6. Don't touch him. And so he was, at the same time, he was, doing all of his occult stuff.
Right. Yeah.
In New York, he infiltrated various schools, even at the Abbey of Thelema. He was running an information conduit, spying on Italy. He possibly was spying on the French, walking over to naval bases, connected with, he had certain, there was a British counselor, a guy with the British consulate who was a 33-degree Mason who Crowley would meet with regularly. So he ended up in Weimar Republic, Germany, connected, various types of information. He was in Russia. He got all kinds of, where Russia was actually his sort of first run, where he got all kinds of information about Russian defense, et cetera, et cetera. Even the document talking about Tesla's research facility being destroyed in Long Island, Crowley's also mentioned there, where the Navy destroyed he built this tower that would provide free electricity. There's just a huge array of stuff. And then he was connected with Jack Parsons from the Rocketry program, which is also connected with Robert Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land.
Right, and Robert Heinlein is one who I connected with all of this in the Spies in Academic Clothing article. He's the one that revealed the academic cells. Yeah,
so you start seeing this real overlap here. But anyways, the interesting thing about Crowley, and which is, my article will give a lot more detail, but that I'm surprised at that. And this is, I'm teaching this class. I was teaching history of rock. I have 20 rock textbooks around my house, right? I haven't taught the class for a while, but I'm looking at how it's handled historically, and then I started to see, wait, if you look at the American folk music, if you look at that totally Crowley influence, if you look at Albert Kinsey was very much a Crowleyite also. He went to they have a huge collection of his original documents at the Kinsey Archive. So that's one of those little things that people try to keep buried. So the Sexual Revolution, and just a book I was reading recently, where and just to tell people, a lot of times I may have to sift through a 600-page book that's 85% BS, but finding out that Crowley actually managed a pop band that he took around on tour in various countries was very interesting to really just finding that quote made it worthwhile. But I mean, this stuff is soft pedaled, hardcore. But anyways, so Crowley, again, the choice of Crowley, and this is a question I'd like just to leave in people's minds. If you want to celebrate doing your own thing, okay, and you can understand there's a time of your life you want to rebel, right? There's lots of examples of rebels, you know. There's lots of examples of people. I mean, I mentioned Henry Miller, who's a good writer, and he lived a pretty bohemian lifestyle. There's lots of artists who lived a bohemian lifestyle. That weren't necessarily associated with deep cover intelligence operations, with texts, magical texts calling for human sacrifice, with massive possible pre-MK Ultra mind control initiations and rituals, who set himself out to totally uproot Western civilization through free love, to bring about the Aeon of Horus, who was, and it was, but by and large was largely forgotten. So why is this good time, have fun Crowley? Why is he there? Who knows? But anyways, just to get into some interesting things, I'll just talk about two events here that are going to tie back both to Altamont and a little bit to Timothy Leary. So should I start with Leary first, or let's go back to Altamont?
Sure.
Altamont also,
and Larry was at Altamont, so.
Yeah. And so Timothy Leary was flown by helicopter just to be there for the Stones performance at Altamont. Rather interesting. Altamont took place on the 60th anniversary of the number 2 major occult ritual that Crowley did in his life, and certainly for those in the occult world, one of the most important occult rituals of the 20th century, if not of many, many centuries, just because of the importance of the ritual. And this ritual, again, which took place the exact same date as Altamont. And if I mix it up with Altamont, please forgive me.
Right.
But basically, just to go through this ritual very quickly, and one thing to say, that this ritual, to really find out what happened, is very difficult, because you get this real soft pedaling of this, which is where Crowley connected with his dark side, and went through all of his negative energy, and just got himself together and was able to take on his mission and do this. So to set the stage, you have Crowley with his new I don't know, you call it, he's not really a love slave, but this guy Newberg was an extremely promising poet that was a recent college graduate, and unfortunately he fell in love with Crowley, who was bisexual, and Crowley made him, and this guy was deeply in love with Crowley. This guy's like 23 years old, 24. He's this kind of very mousy, meek guy. Crowley's this hulking, super athletic, uber charismatic guy. And so he was, more and more was, under Crowley's spell. So they went to Algeria, and I think it's called Batsou, kind of a place in Algeria that we'll come back to a bit later. And he wanted to undertake 2 series of actions. One of them was invoking the Enochian magic of John Dee, and going through the different ethers, right? These ethers are actually altered realities, altered states of consciousness, astral planes or astral experiences. And so he had discovered the Enochian magic stuff when he was in Mexico, helping transfer Mexico's oil over to what would become BP. But anyways, so he was doing these Enochian magic practices, ingesting lots of drugs. If you want to set the scene, you have this giant hulking Crowley carrying a cavalry cross, giant gold cavalry cross, wearing black robes. And this Newberg, this little mousy guy following behind him with his head shaved except for 2 little horns. He had his hair twisted into these red horns on his head, this little devil guy. So they're walking through this, and basically he would go into these different, and this is pretty complicated stuff. I mean, again, this is John Dee's Enochian magic to reach the different ethers. So finally he reached the 19th ether. And basically what they would do is he would, they would ingest drugs. Sometimes Crowley would be reciting the Enochian magic ritual, and he would also invoke Pan by being ritually sodomized by Newberg. And so Newberg was ritually sodomizing while on these mountainsides, and this was invoking the god Pan. through this action. And Crowley viewed this as one of the very important parts of his Serial and Magic, actually, was this ritual sodomy. But basically, Newberg was with this, complete egomaniac. And the sad thing is Newberg was just, way out of his depth. And you can imagine, just getting more and more degraded as the day went. So finally, on the same day as Altamont, it's December 6th, 1909, he began this very powerful ritual to invoke Chronozone, who's considered to be the direct form of the abyss. Okay, this is like the doorway to the abyss. One of the most powerful, extremely powerful, black magic rituals. He drew a triangle in the ground. Newberg was in a protective circle. This went on for a couple days. He did his sacrifice of the pigeons, and then Newberg swore that he heard these. Hopefully, this won't come, but zazas, zazas, nastanda, zazas. It kind of sounds like Zoso, doesn't it? But zazas these are the words supposedly spoken by Adam when the gate of hell was open. And you find this in some of these very esoteric, 9th, 10th century magic handbooks. And then after that, it gets, basically huge amount of these visionary things are described, floating pyramids, this like Osiris boat carrying from the other side, just masses of visions floating around both of these guys. Crowley became supposedly possessed by the demon. Newberg says he would change into various figures. It'd be like his mom, his first girlfriend, and then Crowley he said Crowley transformed into like a giant snake. Crowley took off all his clothes, jumped on Newberg, tried to bite his throat out. And then Newberg protected himself with a dagger, and then it went back to normal. But he had basically, supposedly, opened the abyss and opened this, this is more of a collective, it's not like a deity, it's more of like collective energy of chaos, of pestilence, of plague, of evil. And literally, again, opening hell. And so this ritual was also experienced directly by Timothy Leary. Okay, and they, in fact, according to Brian Barrett was with him, they had almost the exact same experience.
Well, and Leary, when he fled from the U.S., he was hiding out in Algeria at this exact same location where Crowley did this ritual. Is that correct?
Exact same location, because they found out later, supposedly, when he was living in Switzerland, they realized that the dry riverbed they had seen, they were in the exact same place. And so this is basically, described, you can, look at it, the Brian Barrett and Crowley. Leary also talks about it. But basically, they went there, dropped their, super clean, however many micrograms, and we're sitting there in the middle of the desert, and then suddenly they both began having these, the sky basically opened and all these visions came, and Barrett describes in detail many years later what happened. But to sum it all up, these visions align very closely with what Crowley described. And then according to Barrett, Leary began walking around in circles, muttering John Dee's incantations, alchemical formulas. He doesn't say if it's Enochian magic, but the John Dee stuff, he's reciting John Dee's stuff. And then basically they had this sun and moon on parallel sides the next morning, which is also this marriage of heaven and hell, marriage of heaven and earth, union of the opposites. And there's a lot of details, but basically it was like the uber super psychedelic experience. But after that, Crowley, he looked at some Crowley books, he found sitting around supposedly, and he started thinking he was the incarnation of Aleister Crowley.
I'm an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think that I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago, and I think the 60s themselves. Crowley said he was in favor of finding your own self and do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law under love. It was a very powerful statement. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the
and he thought it's actually the reincarnation fulfilling his mission on the earth. He made some statements to that effect. Regarding that, he also mentioned that Crowley was his idol in a sense, because he was doing they had the same project. And he said, I'm just following in the master's footsteps. There's an interview, I think, on PBS where he says that. But he actually implied that he was directly linked with Crowley and could not escape. He said it finds out you can't escape from your programming. Very interesting. Supposedly, according to one of Crowley's biographers, Leary, I keep mixing them up. Leary, again, became obsessed, began reading all these Crowleyan work. Then he got arrested again in Afghanistan. And then he said this is because he had encountered Chronozone, the spirit of chaos, also came into his life. That's why he had to pass through these trials. This idea of going through these trials, going through this suffering in order to reach these higher states or planes of ecstasy. And then according to some, Leary actually ended up later in a prison cell next to Charles Manson, who he said was actually the deity Chronozone incarnated in human flesh. So we see a direct mythologization, so to speak, or almost as I mentioned, the hagiography of almost creating this holy writ of all these events. But we see direct parallels of dates, of times, and even of the particular individuals that were at the same place at the same time, invoking these elements. And I'll just go kind of a little short here, but to finish up this part, it does keep going. But anyways, to take that back up to the future, and again, there's lots more detail we could add, but at Altamont, or perhaps Alamut, again, where Mick Jagger starred in a movie filmed not too long before that event.
Tomorrow he learns what's true and what's not.
Nothing is true. Everything is permitted.
3 people died violent deaths. The one hippie guy fell in the drainage ditch, but 2 guys were killed in a mysterious hit-and-run accident. So you have 3 deaths. There were 3 ritual killings in Crowley's ritual. Okay, 3 ritual killings. And what I found to be very interesting is the press coverage of this story in Rolling Stone in 1970. And what I started to see, I mentioned these interconnections of film, of whatever, is the title story of that article is Let It Bleed. And that, of course, references the Rolling Stones album. And I started looking then at the cover of Rolling Stones album, Let It Bleed. And there you see that, you see this cake, made with all these weird parts, and it's also shattered on the back cover. I have an original copy of that and show it, but basically these are like opening the 7 seals, right? The 7 seals in the Day of Revelations. There's a whole bunch of other things. The number 7 is very important to Crowley. So there's 7 layers of this cake, including a film canister the film is cut out. And in the Rolling Stone article is very extensive. But the one thing to say is they describe in incredible detail how the guy was killed. They have an interview. I have some of this in an article. An interview with someone who saw it there. Then they go and interview a doctor talking in detail about these guys' injuries in graphic detail, going page after page. So in this case, we see that this particular thing, the cover story of the Rolling Stones, and then all these other rock luminaries coming in and talking, giving their take on the text, including Wavy Gravy, who was there, including the Grateful Dead, who were behind setting the festival up, who decided not to play because the energy was too heavy, man. But anyways, but I see this article is also connected with that same ritual process that is certainly tied, and Stones were very much involved with Kenneth Anger. He was advising them directly. There's no way they were not aware of the significance of that day, especially with Kenneth Anger and especially with Anita Pallenberg and all these other people. And incidentally, Anita Pallenberg, the resident witch of the Rolling Stones, also stars in the movie Performance. And I can keep, so there's a whole bunch of that stuff going, but
for all you coincidence theorists out of there, there's a whole lot of coincidences.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah. So, this is, we look at these events. And the thing is that when you look at what Jagger was wearing, when you look at the lyrics to the song, when you look at the timing, when you look at the fact that Leary was brought in by helicopter and then Leary ends up being in the desert in the exact same place, exact same ritual on the same day. You see this weird kind of eerie synchronicity or synchrony. But just to say one last thing here, just a quote about Crowley of the purpose of his ritual magic. Quote, "The nightmare world of Christianity vanished at dawn. The detestable mysteries of sex were transformed into joy and beauty. The obsession of sin fell from my shoulders into the sea of oblivion. And I'll just read a quote. I don't want to read about the quote of the guy watching the stabbing because that's pretty heavy. This is from Tony Sanchez, who was kind of very good friends with Keith Richards, was on tour with the band, who was in the audience. He says, quote, "Strangely, several of the kids were stripping off their clothes and crawling to the stage as if it were a high altar, there to offer themselves as victim for the boots and cues of the Hell's Angels. The more they were beaten and bloodied, the more they were impelled, as if by some supernatural force, to offer themselves as human sacrifices to these agents of Satan." Okay, and this was a very low stage. They talk about all the mistakes that were made, but the stage, it was at a motor speedway. There was not toilets, there was whatever, there was tons of bad acid being circulated around. It was must have been like a living hell on earth. But the stage was so low, the stage was like, 4 or 5 feet high? You're even less than that. I mean, the stage was, I could just walk up on the stage easily. The stage, it was almost like the Rolling Stones. You have a separation of like the Crowleyan magic between the ritual, the stage, and the audience is blurred. So in that concert, the audience, the stars, so to speak, and as Crowley said, everybody is a star. But the stage is brought down to a level where the fans can access it, right? And this is the Rolling Stones, at the height of their major peak of popularity, where you're normally going to see them as little dots, 100 miles away. You can run up on stage, right? So you have this the ritual, everyone is now included because Jagger is like the celebrant of the ritual. He's no longer separated by that performative space, not even the physical space, but also sort of the star, the star space, right? He's right there in front of the audience. So that's, it's quite a fascinating topic there, but we can, continue on in some more depth here as we either do next episode or part 5B.
Well, did you want to cover the Beatles and Stones, those connections there, or did we already cover that?
You know what? I've got to take a 15-minute lesson.
We just had a little bit of a break there. We're going to continue now with the Beatles and Stones and Crowley.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that how Crowley, again, to stress, someone who was memorialized with an Indian dinner where people ate a bunch of hot spices just a few years before. He basically, Kenneth Anger was certainly important, but he was very much an underground person. And probably look a little bit again at that Harry Smith video, because Harry Smith also is linked with the introduction of these ideas. But the thing is so how did they meet the teachings of Crowley? I mean, what was sort of the vector point? And I started out by actually looking at the cover art to Sgt. Pepper's, and I started discovering a lot of different interesting symbolism on there. Of course, Crowley is there, but also there's a number of different, a lot of symbolic meaning that's, there's always the controversy. Well, Lenin wanted to put Hitler on there. He was one of our heroes. But, it's something that, when you look at the cover, it's actually kind of a macabre scene. Again, it was supposed to show the death of, the death of the Beatles and their new image, whatever. But there's a lot of strange things. One being that Crowley talked about the number 11. My number is 11, as all their numbers who are of us. There's 11 Freemasons in the Sgt. Pepper's cover. Aleister Crowley, H.G. Wells, Karl Marx, W.C. Fields, Sir Robert Peel, Aldous Huxley, Stan Laurel, Oliver Hardy, Tom Mix, Oscar Wilde, and T.E. Lawrence. And they originally wanted to include people like Marquis de Sade, etc. But Crowley is there twice. Crowley is there wearing the uniform of the Order of the Buffalo, which is a sort of a semi-Masonic fraternity for musicians, right? And so it's a pretty complicated cover. And then John Lennon, said, I guess this was some years later, he's like, just do what you want to do, as long as you don't hurt anybody. It's, something like that is sort of a mishmash paraphrase of Crowley. But the Rolling Stone, this album, Sgt. Pepper's, is in fact related to Crowley in that Crowley died basically about 20 years to the day that Sgt. Pepper's was released. So you think 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. And Robert Fraser, who was part of the swinging London scene, who was, pretty influential sort of in occult matters. He had his art gallery. He helped design the cover for this album, and it's reputed that he also was very important in introducing both the Beatles and the Stones to Crowley's teaching pre-Kenneth Anger. And Robert Fraser was friends with Christopher Gibbs, they both went to Eton. And so you have a lot of high society people that were involved in this scene. And certainly Robert Fraser was. So this particular elite echelon was an important vector for sort of spreading the teachings of Crowley. And it's important to note that the Rolling Stones and Beatles, if you put their album covers side by side, the Stones would come up with an album cover very similar to the Beatles, but different. So after every Beatles album, there was a Stones album that was maybe a little bit darker take. So you put, I have a slide on that, but if you look at the Beatles, the original, I was trying to get to Sgt. Pepper's, the original album, they kind of evolve. And you notice only one eye is showing, right? They all have one eye. And then we look at, say, Magical Mystery Tour, and we get much more, these alter egos, this thing, and then, this inner booklet. There's a lot of very weird, photographs in here, like this, for example. We have wizard stuff. And so, anyways, the Sgt. Pepper's cover, was influenced by Robert Fraser, who, again, was a segue to the avant-garde world. Harry Smith would not have been known except for the guy who did the anthology, but avant-garde world of film and sort of high art, which was not really part of the rock scene. And also with the art design was the Fool Art Collective. This was an art collective that did a lot of albums and a lot of clothing for many people in the swinging 60s. And they painted John Lennon's piano. They made a pretty far-out film called Through the Wonderwall, which is a heavy duty, you want to talk about an MK Ultra sort of programming document. But the Full Art Collective, again, they're designing clothing, they're designing the outfits, they're designing many, many album covers, and they're very much involved in this, Sgt. Pepper's, but, all across the board. And they, their name was influenced supposedly by Graham Bond, who was a mainstay on the British rock scene. And he got heavily involved, directly involved into black magic. He had some bands, he would try to do magic ceremonies on stage. And so the art collective took their name from Graham Bond's influence, because the Fool is one of the major figures in Crowley's tarot deck, right? And so, again, the Fool was a very important entity because they really helped design the look of the 60s, of the psychedelic era, as well as being connected with this this particular cover. And so from there, there's some other kind of mysterious things, like where there's a Ian Lacamo or something like that. This is supposedly Paul McCartney's name backwards that he used sometimes as a pseudonym. So if you play Paul McCartney's name backwards, it sounds like Ilan Lacamo, or approximately like that. And there's a couple ads, like John Lennon got an invitation to go to this art gallery where there was some kind of magical occult people there, initiation. There's another advertisement placed under the same name where he's looking for real black magicians, and he wants them to, and he said, if you are not real, you will be dealt with, or something. So supposedly this was Paul McCartney's name, and he helped to kind of bring John Lennon into it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But as we look a little bit more deeply, we have Caleb Aspern Dunning was the assistant manager and also the Beatles astrologer. Okay, he was a Beatles personal astrologer. So the Beatles had an astrologer that would, go through, make sure whatever they were going to do in the day. And so he ended up supposedly, did too much acid. He got fired and joined the Process Church. So we have a direct connection from their Beatles personal astrologer to the Process Church. And then also McCartney was paid for supported the Process Church magazine. He paid for a number of their issues and had some interviews with them. And so all these people are kind of bouncing around in this area. And basically the Crowleyan influence, it's, if, you're looking at a film project, if you look at, there's Lucifer Rising, the Kenneth Anger film, but you look at, the Stones' direct involvement with that. If you're looking at something like a film like Performance, I mean, it takes a long time. I mean, I'm doing some film work. I mean, to put a film together, you don't just do that, split second. I mean, even if it's a psychedelic film. So it stands to reason that probably Lennon was aware of these guys or connected with them, as well as McCartney, prior to 1967 or whatever, when that supposedly happened, and immediately everyone transformed. Do you have anything you want to?
No, should we? You want to hit Corpus Hermeticum?
Yeah. So, what we see is that there's the Corpus Hermeticum, this idea of this, using these kind of alchemical processes. This Hermes, this magic is disguised in a lot of different ways, and you see these dual polarities. And, as I mentioned, the Stones and the Beatles, each one of their covers, they follow each other. So the Stones' answer to Sgt. Pepper's was Their Satanic Majesty's Request. But pretty much across the board, the cover art is the same. And, I, understood that, or I used to teach that.
Do you have some of the Stones covers you can show us? Or we can just edit it in?
Yeah, we edit it in.
All right, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so, the artwork and the visual imagery should not be discounted, especially if you look at people that are in intensely hypnotic states, taking LSD, listening to these albums, right? These are going to have major impact and reference points. And if you look at the Sgt. Pepper's, you notice a doll wearing a Rolling Stones shirt. It's actually a Shirley Temple doll. And that, so that's kind of an interesting aside. There's also several vectors, in terms of the geometry of where the figures are aligning, and with like the pillars of Jacquem, etc., the Masonic two pillars. Even as the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were fulfilling that function, you have light and dark, so to speak, but both part of the same process. So they certainly followed each other, and whether or not that was a marketing, ploy or something much deeper, it's hard to say. But needless, with Anger and all these guys, Mick Jagger got increasingly involved in the occult, in just different types of scenes. There were reports of rituals going on their property. People finding dead animals, hearing like weird chanting late at night. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So, and Anita Pallenberg was sort of like the sacred whore, so to speak. This is also known as a Scarlet Woman, and it's very the Stones, they found it's like a woman that's shared, but even though she's a shared woman, like the Whore of Babylon, she has some certain mystical power, but she's, so you find also that same thing in, the Hellfire Club, and then with the, Anita Pallenberg, who was also in the movie Performance, right? And so again, they're both in, sharing the same woman. And then in, 1966, you have the death of Tara Brown, who was after, taking acid with, Paul McCartney, and you see this herald of the double-headed eagle, and the double-headed eagle actually ties into the Dome and into the Zabbatai Zevi, the double-headed eagle crest or herald, and that's actually on the grave of this guy, Tara Brown. So from this thing, I mean, in the full art collective, if you go on to look at Wonderwall and stuff, these guys are very much connected with this manipulation of consciousness, of this ritual induction. And so we go back to, Arthur Brown, I am the god of hellfire and I bring you fire, right? You have a number of rock stars identifying directly with this as their ethos, but actually trying to invoke it, as did Graham Bond, as did Jimmy Page, who also was going to work with Kenneth Anger. Kenneth Anger is kind of typical of some of these Crowleyites, had a very, kind of unpleasant personality, so he ended up, not working with Jimmy Page. But Kenneth Anger was also connected with Shirley Temple, right? So Shirley Temple, Hollywood, early Hollywood, he was also kind of a child star. So you start to see that there are both the visual imagery and the activities, imply that there's more than just a superficial connection, especially when you start looking at some of the other Beatles songs as they get into more kind of darker or intense references. And, so, again, as we see these events, one thing to note is just, briefly mention that Crowley's aesthetic of performance, which I kind of alluded to, right? But there's a lot of Crowleyan language that shows up in many, many pop songs. Even the idea of being a star, superstars, right? Numerological stuff, lots of symbolic stuff, really across the board. And again, if we look at Timothy Leary, identifying himself with Crowley and his autobiography, Confessions of a Hope Fiend, which is an amalgamation of two of Crowley's books. So, these particular, formulations are, very, very deep, and yet at the same time they are very, pernicious, so to speak. So, this again, these ideas of the rock star as shaman. When you look at, I can give, a bunch of other quotes related to that, but as even like Gene Simmons, as I mentioned, so many rock stars describe the power they have over the audience. The Grateful Dead describes their performances, as church, and they're invoking and leading the mass and taking the ferry, the boat to the other side. They're carrying their fans, through this ecstatic ritual. And so, when we see this, Crowley's performance, Crowley's first attempt to do that was, he did a ceremony. This was kind of a closed ceremony. And after the success of that, he did another public performance. And he made a statement that because of the change in the time, because of the new epoch, again, this very millenarian thing. He saw himself as a vehicle of the beast. He saw himself as a vehicle of either Satan or one of these other sort of demonic entities, and saw that all his action was being guided through these people. And so he sort of consulted and realized that it was possible and in fact necessary to take ritual and turn it into a public performance. And this serves as multiple particular agendas. The first thing with the ritual magic, which exact words invoked by Page, right? Ritual magic. As I already said, art is magic and magic is art. So this is the idea that the ritual is using the public itself as a vector, not only to entice people into the particular, religious school. He mentioned that this was a way to give people the state of ecstasy or a buzz or enthusiasm, right? That, or as Ray Manzarek would say, raising the Kundalini, right? Giving this excitement, this kind of thrilling state. And so he decided to combine this thing into, he wrote a play, The Rites of Elysius, which was pretty complicated play. And it basically was not particularly popular, but it was a ritual invocation. It had nothing to do with Elysius, but it was, each segment of the play was actually a magic ritual, sort of guised in drama, in which the audience was also a participant. And at the same time, it works on multiple levels, because as turning the ritual into a performative event, Crowley also was receiving the benefit, so to speak. He would personally develop his power by all these other people there who are also being entrained and brought in a sense, they themselves could also be seen as either sacrificial victims, willing dupes, or recruits. So, go ahead.
I was just thinking, okay, so Albert Hoffman invents LSD. He's working with Gordon Wasson, the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, who's also working with Professor Carl Ruck at Boston University. And the three of them write the book selling the Dionysian mysteries connected to LSD and ergot called Persephone's Quest. Or no, wait, I'm sorry. No, it was not Persephone's Quest. It was their book, Road to Ulysses, excuse me.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, you see very similar thinking, and we didn't really get into the Golden Dawn, but all these sort of organizations were very important, not only for, recruitment you think about an intelligence organization, this is like the hierarchical model, going back to Hassani Sabbah, even the Masons, or even more secretive organizations. So these were often recruiting grounds where actually, Crowley was also, associated with people and other, people, the same, Huxley met him in Germany when he was also working against the Germans in the same kind of double agent role. And just one thing, Crowley had multiple aliases, right? He was very much, covering himself in aliases, but this whole archaic revival and the use of even coded, there's always a soft cell level, there's a peace and love level, there's the expand your mind level, there's a let's push the boundaries level, and then there's a certain point when the initiations have gone too far and you can't get back out again, and then you start to see the real, what's actually really going on, which is very, very different than you see on the surface. But interestingly enough, Crowley, after his performance, this idea of using light, sound, music, and ritual to work on the audience is what we see, this alchemical processing of the audience. Again, we see that in what Jimmy Page said. We see that in these album covers. We see that in these linked cultural productions, even over several years, right? So, and just to a little bit more about Crowley. So Crowley, not only did he do this, play, and he wrote a bunch of other dramas, some of which didn't work, but his Invocation of the Moon, again, where there's a violin player and people would drink the chalice. You could buy a ticket and sit there and drink peyote and wine. I'm sure people didn't know there was peyote in it. That may be why it was so popular. But the ritual stuff, he eventually moved on, but he said this was an important component, again, in this new era, in that, in a sense, you're doing this ritual practice and you're doing these large-scale rituals on other people. But Crowley actually started his own band. So Crowley managed a girl group. He had a ragtime band with 7 women featuring one of his main concubines in the group as the lead singer. And he toured, he went several places, went to Russia. Some of these tours, of course, connected with intelligence missions. But he used this as, again, pop music, but at the same time encoding the ritual process in pop music. And actually, there was something known as the Temple of the Beetle, which was in England, which is another Crowley associated organization where the lead singer for his ragtime band was the high priestess of. So there's a weird little Beatles connection there, Temple of the Beetle. That's a pretty obscure order, out of the many that Crowley was involved in. But so, you really see this idea of utilizing pop culture as a vector for these occult initiations. And in fact, the ritual processing of multiple facets of the entire generation of the 1960s, of specific individuals, of specific concert programs, of the album cover art, and also into the society at large, right? Also into how these are related to particular public events, particular moments, right? And you can look at the film aspect, you look at Rosemary's Baby, you look at how that ties in with all of these things. And John Lennon said the first time they tripped was at, the mansion, Doris Day's old mansion, which is where Sharon Tate was murdered. So that's the first time they took acid. And after reviewing this, you start to see that perhaps Manson was not off base when he said there was a whole layer of these encoded messages within the Beatles' music.
Well, and we should also, I just want to point out Miles Mathis's work here, and he's done work suggesting that Sharon Tate wasn't murdered and that was all just a ritual show put on for the public again.
Yeah, and that's, that's another aspect of it that, the one thing, to be careful with is that you have stuff like September Clues, when you can get too far. I know people who have gotten into things, everything is fake, even satellites.
I just read, and I'll post the link up and people can read the Mathis article there for themselves and see the evidence. I think he puts together a fairly strong argument to suggest things, and Sharon Tate was also seen in, I think it was Brazil, like a month after the supposed murder, etc.
Yeah, and then that's quite possible. I mean, because also this idea of the deception, right? The deception that occurs with these activities, and especially if someone is on board with something, if they are a participant, there's a chance that they may survive. There's also a chance that they may die, right? And also, and just again with the idea of vectors, we can probably talk about this if we continue on. But if you look at the people that introduced the Stones to LSD, the people that introduced Beatles to LSD, you can look at these vectors. You also look at individual bands where there's a controlling force. So there's always, I said that before, but even if you look at, there are, if you look at the hierarchical model of control, if you control one guy in a band and he'll control the other members or influence them, and then these band members, this band itself will influence hundreds of millions of people, then you have a very, very powerful vector. And, going to like Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page was a major one involved in the occult there with Led Zeppelin, and Robert Plant. There's a sort of a pathetic, not pathetic, but a semi-heart-rending quote. They suffered a lot, right? He had a child die. He had all kind. They started having all this bad luck. They called it the Led Zeppelin Curse, and they started blaming Jimmy Page for doing it because all of his black magic stuff he was doing. And Robert Plant said, "I would trade everything. Just having a happy family, if you're with your family, all this doesn't mean anything. All this is nothing. All my stardom, all my fame is meaningless." So even, someone like that, that goes into these levels ends up, if they go too far and they get sort of pulled into it and they can't turn around. On the other hand, you look at someone like Keith Richards or whatever, they embrace this. Robert Plant completely embraces it, and then someone like Lennon could have possibly broken with his conditioning. But the fact is that the ritual process of music is very powerful, and the effects it can have. And may mention on the radio, but there's a rock many times where rock bands have incited their fans to riot deliberately, or incited their fans to do different activities. There was Woodstock 2 had a number of examples of that, including massive amounts of arson, looting, and burning. The people getting handed out peace candles, and then the Red Hot Chili Peppers doing this ecstatic version of fire, and people started setting stuff on fire with their quote unquote peace candles. There's another band there that said let's break some shit, let's do it, and so time to get crazy, and there and people started breaking things. Another one of the artists got people to rape women and things like that, and so this happened at Woodstock too, and so this is something that a lot of artists talk about, is the power they have over their audience to make I think Alice Cooper said something like, "I can make my audience do anything I want. I can make them do anything." A lot of these stars have echoed the fact they have this massive control over their fans. And another example of that is the band Exodus, and they had a show, and they said, go out and kill a poser.
What do you guys do with posers? What do you teach them? A what?
And the fans went out and found a guy wearing spandex and slit his throat in front of the band. Picked the guy up, some cheesy guy, and murdered him. And another band, I saw an interview with another band talking about it, and it was like, that was totally hilarious, man. That was so funny. And a lot of times with these incidents of violence, you see them discussed as humor, as entertainment. So again, back to Crowley, if you look at this mass ritual process, taking these alchemical formula, taking sort of these esoteric initiatory rites, which for whatever reason can have a major effect on the mind when you add that in with the music, and you add that in with the substance people are taking, you add that in with the collective energy, and you also add that in with this sort of dual hypnotic suggestion level, you get a major powerful force to change society and culture. And so, and this goes into actually this idea of what's known as the etheric connection, which we find across the board in many of these mystery schools. And this is an idea of you go through all these stages of initiation. You go through stages of sort of annihilating your self-consciousness, of annihilating your identity, of doing, suffering, of, getting some types of ecstasy, of, going through more and more elaborate ritual initiations, to at the point you have completely given your will over to that organization, at which point you begin to receive transmission, so to speak, via either astral travel or known as the etheric connection. And this etheric connection, which is described, is found in many of these occult societies. And the fact is, of course, who are they connecting with? Are they connecting with other human beings, which is sort of what I believe. But the fact is these people are possibly receiving messages or believe they are. And Crowley, his whole goal is connecting with the holy guardian angel. And again, a lot of these musicians talk about connecting with this force of channeling their music, of having it appear to them. But the fact is the use of this quote-unquote connection with the masters, also known as the Great White Lodge in certain occult or mystery schools. This is, number one, before these methods are revealed to people, they have been thoroughly indoctrinated. It's very, at that point, it's probably impossible for them to get out. But in a sense, a lot of these artists are talking about having a direct connection through the music, through these trance states with these forces, with these higher powers, with the religious state. And I would argue that to a certain extent, these connections, so to speak, which is, again, used for very high-level occult initiatives, for example, the Theophilosophical Society and all these other people, receiving these disembodied masters, communicating with them, is sort of something certainly shown in the occult processing of these rock concerts, right? And so when people talk about going to these other states, whether it's a techno, whether it's this or that, they're actually in that state not only of hypersuggestibility and hypnotic trance, but, and again, I'm not stating that I have full proof of this, but this is what it says in the literature, and I've gone through a ton of it now, and I won't get into the details, but this idea of, again, becoming connecting with these sort of disembodied masters, all this out-of-body stuff is exactly kind of what's going on, whether or not that's actually happening in the trance ritual induction in these rock concerts and things like that. And so I'll just call your attention to one article, Inner Voice Target Tracking and Behavioral Influence Technologies. And this describes a lot of these different technologies. Development of remote wireless ultrasound and microwave internal voice transmission, human tracking technologies, references recognizing behavioral influence capabilities and the use of such technologies against humans. Then we get into infrasonic sound, we get into all this other stuff. And with these occult stuff, they're actually dealing with electromagnetic energy and forces, which is the same thing we find if we want to look at the Temple of Set. Now General Michael Aquino talks about these things as well, but there's certainly a technological basis. And I won't get into all these patents from the early 60s and earlier in the 50s that talk about use of these different types of consciousness influencing technologies, embedding commands, using photic driving with sound for hypnotic command, emplacement, changing, mind states, frequency piggybacking, etc. So I think this is all connected in sort of coming from the same thing. Now, but what I want to say is that a lot of times these religious experiences, when people think they're connecting with a higher power and they're having these ecstatic states, going back to the last lecture, this kundalini. So there is some type of experiences people have. But when it's raised unevenly, or when you invoke sort of the electrochemical magnetic processes of the body, you can get, especially if they're done unevenly, especially if the intellect is not developed, especially if it's being done surreptitiously, it basically destabilizes the individual and can actually do some kind of mass imprinting on large groups of people. And so this mass ritual process that Crowley was talking about, that some of these other artists were invoking, is, I think, sort of the deeper level that we can go into. Maybe these things are certainly connected. Again, we have a general admission from Jimmy Page, but when you start tracking down the symbolism, then you find these connections to many of these sort of secret societies, many of which had these aims of political transformation, of creating a new world state, of all these different things, which are clearly expressed. And if you look at the Anthrophilosophical Society, which was a breakaway from the Theophilosophical Society, because Annie Besant, the little Fabian, was starting to drive people nuts when they, she said that they have to, every word coming from her is from the master and they have to obey what she says. So Rudolf Steiner broke off and started this group in Germany. And I read through all of his initiatory rites. He used this thing called Eurythmics, which was a dance music ritual induction ceremony. And in fact, what happens is that there's Ebulia, right? Ebulia is a loss of will. There's a loss of willpower. And one thing to say is that, like, for example, meditation, I think there's a lot of very valuable meditational practices that one can do that I've had experience with myself. But the fact is that a lot of this emphasis, turn off your mind, right, of this stuff, really what you have is a small scale example of, you look at you and Cameron psychic driving, you find that being done, and you find, in a sense, on a smaller scale, scripts, implementation of various scripts through symbolic language, again, through ritual processes.
As well as Gregory Bateson's double bind that was sold by Alan Watts and everything as part of the meditation process.
Exactly. And that's one thing that I noticed. And, again, when I looked at Strawberry Fields Forever, and I started noticing all of John Lennon's lyrics, which we've mentioned, but I'll mention again, all you need is love. And they did that set, also designed by the Fool Collective. And I encourage everyone to watch Wonderwall and just see this very far out group that's kind of unknown, but major influences. So you see that, there's a use of many different layers to this process. But so that's what I'm getting to sort of in a deeper way, is sort of embedding of hypnotic scripts within language, within music, within subcultural groups. And you can look at these processes going on in very small scale and very large scale arenas. And so I talked about the Source family a little bit, and that's a great case study of this whole thing, because the Source family, you have this charismatic leader, the guy, ex-military, huge guy, accidentally kills a couple people, suddenly he starts this hippie cult, he's got all these followers, peace, love, vegetarianism, veganism,
right?
They start the psychedelic rock band, and they're
Father Yod or James Baker.
Father Yod, who is just a pretty sort of a Crowleyan kind of individual. And one of the commandments of the group was one woman, one man. Then he takes on a group marriage of 15 or 16 15, 16-year-old girls, right? He has this group marriage, marries all these women, he's, and people are starting to go nuts, and it's very bizarre circumstances. But they recorded 65 albums at the time. They had their own studio, and they were playing concerts, and now they're being brought back to the mainstream, and people are doing, covering their music and all this stuff. But and that's an example of a small scale, if you want to look at a microcosmic example of anything from what Aleister Crowley did to his followers, who were, when he's at his Abbey of Thelema, and just, taking them through these incredible amount of debauchery, culminating in doing things with goats and whatever, and just degrading them more and more. 2 children were born, blah, blah, blah. I mean, people ended up as human wreckage, and Crowley just kind of walks away from it. It's the same thing. This is, and if you look at it done on a mass scale, but the abdication of will is a very important central process. And part of that, to abdicate the will, requires a type of flattery. You involve people. How does it feel to be one of the beautiful people? How does it feel to be part of the new generation? How does it feel to be breaking boundaries and have free love? And again, the free love, I mean, I'm nothing against love and whatever. I mean, maybe society was way too uptight before about sexuality. But if you look at Kinsey, if you look at Crowley and his just everything known to man, if you look at this current state of the family unit, and all this stuff, you find, very destructive currents running from this energy, because, you look at sex magic. I mean, there's a great energy with sex. I mean, there's a very powerful thing that can happen, but it also can be powerfully destructive as well as being powerfully addictive. And also, again, one of those another types, you could say flattery, but more of a pleasure instinct. So suddenly, how much of the scene also, you got these women are suddenly groupies showing up. How many of these groupies, there may be groupies that were brought on board, maybe they're attracted to the rock stars, or maybe some of these, this thing, you're attracting thousands of millions of people to this music because of the women are attracted because of the men, everyone's being flattered, they're breaking the boundaries, they're going for peace and love, it's our generation, we're standing forward. At the same time, there's a deployment of certain types of psychic driving in a certain way through light, sound, music, lyrical stuff. And then even more powerfully, I think, is this occult dimension where people are being taken on occult journeys, on ritual initiation processes, on major amounts of psychedelic drugs and other things. So you look at that, and we look at Woodstock itself. Here's a Woodstock album. And I think album covers are also important, maybe not so much now in the day of the CD. We see the front cover. It's kind of a weird picture, right? You
got to hold it up there.
I mean, why would you choose that as a picture for Woodstock? I mean, it's okay. But then you can look at the different imagery and symbolism in that cover. Let's look at the back cover, Return to the Garden of Eden, right, washing in the mud, kind of a weird picture. And on the front cover, you have this butterfly, nice little monarch, mind control butterfly thing. See that?
Yep.
And some other stuff, and then you look inside, blah, blah, blah. I was looking at Santana, but I mean, so, and just to finish up, there's, when it really starts getting ugly, and I won't get so much into that, is you have the next level of the ritual processing, you could say, is this, first of all, you have the creation of a group, right? You have the creation of a homogenized, unified group identity. You shatter that. You suddenly have all these different genres exploding all over, right? All these like subgenres, right? You have all these different things going. And you have people say like David Bowie, who's very, very heavily influenced by Aleister Crowley, very heavily looking at his music also in the same way as this occult ritual practice being done on his audience, also giving them power. Because the fact, it's also a spell, right? He's looking at that coming from spelling, right? So Bowie also is deeply into that. But if you look at the Stones, they start talking about serial killers, right? You have the Manson Helter Skelter. That's kind of the first really serial killer. And then you have the Stones talking about the same thing. I put my fist through your steel-plated door. The Midnight Rambler. I mean, that's about a serial killer. That gets into the Son of Sam killings. And then we have the Process Church with their 3 deities. And the Process Church is a direct link to many of these rock stars. They tried to recruit a lot of rock stars. Again, they're part of the swinging London scene. And with the Process Church and the Zodiac Killers and the Finders, I mean, these are all examples of you suddenly have this induction of terror on the society, and it's actually coming out. It's at least tangentially, if not occasionally directly connected with the music scene, but also with the fragmentation of that music scene. And for example, the Zodiac Killer is putting out all these articles, these cryptic statements in the newspaper. He was never found. Is it one person? Is it multiple people? This is a mass process using the media through the same type of induction ceremony. And then this is tied into the music. And then you have the death metal that's tied, that actually celebrates many of these serial killers. And just an example is, G.G. Allen meant John Wayne Gacy and stuff. And so you actually have this occult aspect tying into these experimental cults. I mean, some of these, cult groups like Jim Jones and stuff, these were coming off of, I would speculate, coming off of some of the research done in the 60s, and you look at all these sub-projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely Jim Jones, et cetera, connected in.
Yeah. And just to sum up here, we look at Crowley, connected again with lots of people that are important. And, Jack Parsons was another kind of Crowleyan guy that ended up, really being excited by Crowley, by this idea of free love. He was also kind of a science fiction guy. He got influenced to do rockets from science fiction. So he's also connected with kind of science fiction fantasy worlds as well. But he ended up joining the Crowley Lodge in California. And, again, he was a major innovator in rocket science. He helped actually really a lot of our rocketry technology, primarily fuel-based, was coming from him. But he started getting into, he eventually become a leader of the Hollywood Lodge, and we also see coming out of that, sort of the residue of that lodge, we also see the Church of Satan coming out of there too. But Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard showed up on the scene, and basically everyone keeps seducing Parsons' wife. I'm not sure why. And then he got a new wife, and she got seduced. And initially, he was having kind of free love parties that Heinlein used to go to also, Crowleyan influenced parties. But he and L. Ron Hubbard decided to try to summon the Moonchild. And the Moonchild is this sacred being brought into the earth, the Dalaj. The Dalaj in Islam is the Antichrist, right? So trying to summon the Antichrist, have this ritual sex magic and bring to birth this Moonchild. And basically, and there's a lot of songs about the Moonchild, right? You can think of, there's a lot of references to this as well throughout the whole pop cultural world. And even bands, it seems innocuous as Fleetwood Mac, are also heavily involved into this stuff, big time.
Black Magic Woman, or was that?
That's Santana.
Yeah.
Well, Santana, right. Santana is connected with the angel Metatron. It has this whole Metatron thing set up in his studio. He does all this ritual invocational. So Santana's also way out there in certain ways. But this is an important sort of event, and there's also connections with this again through the 60s. But so Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, when L. Ron Hubbard first met Parsons, he said he was sent by military intelligence to break up a black magic ring when he met Parsons, and of course Hubbard, we know all about his various connections with all kinds of stuff and his own
the intel community and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, and Parsons is kind of instructive because he got more and more, he corresponded directly with Crowley over a number of years, and really was very worshipful. And he's another example of someone that was sort of brought, he ended up kind of, he started getting more and more out there. And he changed his name to Belaron Almoros al-Dalaj Antichrist. So that he changed his name to that. And became more and more unstable, and then died in an accidental explosion in his rocket lab. So he got blown up. But just give a glimpse of this "Do What Thou Wilt" Crowleyan ethos. So he wrote this poem, I think, kind of sums up this ecstatic state you get to at the same time, the dissolution of reason. And this is Parsons' poem. I hike Don Quixote. I live on peyote, marijuana, morphine, and cocaine. I never know sadness, but only a madness that burns at the heart and the brain. I see each charwoman, ecstatic, inhuman, angelic, demonic, divine, each wagon a dragon, each beer mug a flagon that brims with ambrosial wine. So that's Jack Parsons at the end of his initiatory journey. And again, he was sort of the all-American guy, incredibly handsome, talented, everything. He had everything and ended up another mentally damaged wreck. And so, not to, belabor the point, but, when you start really getting into all the details of some of this, ritual murder stuff, and Crowley talking about needing to drench the earth in blood to bring about the inception of the age of Thelema, and then his instrumental function in World War I, at least in terms of the sink of the Lusitania, is quite interesting. And then, I myself have, seen, we probably all know people who have gotten on this trip, so to speak, that this is a path for enlightenment. You're going through, you're taking on, these different, experiences, and you're pushing the edge and you're pushing the boundaries, and you have to get the heroic dose going, and you're gonna break on through to the other side. And this is what you're meant to do in the world, to heal the world, right? This is sort of what is partial, knowledge.
Yeah, sure. Been there, done that.
But feel free to jump in. I know
we should probably wrap it up here. We're right at 2 hours, and we still haven't even gotten into the FM and radio stuff yet.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So just to summarize, I mean, I think those of us who have gone into some of these kind of experimentation have probably had some experiences where we've connected. I mean, I've talked about my church trip to the Santo Daime Church. When I started doing this research, I realized that's the exact same thing, even more intense level, because everyone's on ayahuasca, right? But it's whether or not this is, whether or not these symbolic things have power in the material world, they certainly have power on the human consciousness.
Absolutely.
And it's this is a vast array that hopefully we, brought some of this to clarity today.
Excellent. All right, let's close it here.
All right, man.
All right.
Take care of you.
You too.